My name is Paulo Barroso. I'm in the faculty of Boston College Law School, and we are delighted to introduce our distinguished guest today, His Excellency Mr. Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Mr. Almagro has a distinguished career as a Uruguayan diplomat. He served in Germany, in Iran, was ambassador to China for about 5 years. He's a lawyer by education. He was the Minister of Foreign Relations of Uruguay for a number of years and was unanimously elected Secretary General of the organization at about 4 years ago. Mr. Almagro's biography has only one faulty point. He doesn't care much about children. He only has 7 of them. But we will not be too hard on him for that. I welcome you on behalf of Professor Vlad Perju, the director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy, and I want to take this moment to acknowledge and thank Dr. Daniela Rosa, who is a distinguished member of our community here, who is leading the Clough Center initiative on democracy in the Americas. The format today is the Secretary General will speak for as long as he wants, but he estimates that he will take about 15, 20 minutes. Then I will ask him a couple of questions to get the conversation started, and then we're going to open to the audience, and we will keep the conversation going until we are forced to stop. I want to say that in times such as this, in the United States and across the Americas, we are reminded of the value of the web of institutions that sustain our imperfect but nonetheless essential achievements in democracy, in peace, and justice. We take for granted those achievements, and the institutions that support, sustain those achievements are not visible on a daily basis necessarily. But in times of crisis, we are reminded of how much we owe to the institutions and the practices and the culture that sustain our practices. The Organization of American States is one such institution. And the leadership of the Secretary General has been outstanding in these dark times. There will be a renaissance, but and then the OAS will maybe again become less visible on a daily basis. But we shall never forget how essential it is, organizations and institutions such as this. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce and surrender the floor to His Excellency, the Secretary General, Luis Almagro.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you. It is not for nothing that the Organization of American States is recognized as the world's oldest regional organization. In fact, last week marked the 130th anniversary of the birth of the InterAmerican system. On October 2nd, 1889, the first International Conference of American States was held, which created the precursor of the modern OAS called the International Union of American Republics. After 130 years of history as a liberal international institution, it is not in vain that the OAS have the central role in dealing with the hemisphere's policy agenda. It has a solid normative basis to support democracy and human rights. It has a solid basis for protecting people, and not necessarily states, as some may argue. Jointly protecting the value of life and the value of peace among nations, we were innovators in this land from the beginning. Our national identities were forged with war. We carry in our DNA the gene of the fight for liberty. Peace in our hemisphere was built by fighting for freedom. No oppression, no dictatorship, no torture, no assassination was ever able to stop us. Peace can only be had by having our rights recognized. Human dignity guaranteed by way of the effective exercise of constitutional democracy and protection of human rights stands firm at the core of our organization. The values and principles enshrined in the Inter-American norms represent a legal and moral obligation for member states. Article 2 of the Organization of American States Charter states that one of its purposes is to promote and consolidate representative democracy. The United Nations Charter does not mention the word democracy. And this is a very relevant point because pretty much our democracies are affected by our own faults, but also by external forces that they don't believe so much in democracy. This first article of the Inter-American Democratic Charter affirms democracy as a human right. The people of the Americas have a right to democracy, and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. Democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the people of the Americas. Moreover, Article 3 defines what the essential elements of representative democracy are: respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, access to and exercise of power in accordance with the rule of law, the holding of periodic, free, and fair elections based on secret balloting and universal suffrage as an expression of the sovereignty of the people. The pluralistic system of political parties and organizations, and the separation of powers and independence of the branches of government. The roadmap of the values of human dignity and freedom are already written and agreed to in the Inter-American system, even if some don't act on it, decide to ignore them, or prefer to be permissive when others don't comply. We did not discover or inherit these values and principles out of thin air. The Inter-American system created them. More rights for more people also involve more peace, more sovereignty, more justice. That's the essence of multilateralism. And that's the raison d'etre of this organization. It's good for us to feel the weight of history and the weight of our commitment to people, who must be more alive today than ever before. The risk of the day-to-day bureaucratic exercise of multilateralism that often gets entangled in pipe dreams and lengthy political motivated discussions that instead of bringing us together, take us farther away from the commitment. We are obliged to defend the age-old principles, the crucial fundamental freedoms, constitutional democracy, with new instruments and modern tools. People today want to be heard. They want and need to be heard. People today cannot understand and should not understand that multilateral organizations can be blind, deaf, and mute. They insist that we assume our responsibility. They demand that we feel what they feel. They demand that we talk about their complaints. People today need new efficiency standards to guarantee them their rights in real time, to attack corruption in real time, to attack drug trafficking in real time, and to attack organized crime in real time. Unfortunately, we have to witness how the worst tyrants seek to muzzle citizens, break them, and keep them in misery so they can't find even the strength to claim what is rightfully theirs. Silencing people is the strongest way to break people's sovereignty. We cannot stand by and feel comfortable witnessing this reality, while at the same time dictators use new tools to more effectively repress and censor and to hide the aberrations they carry out on a daily basis. As the voice of the press, the voice of those discriminated that suffer discrimination, the voice of the voiceless, the OAS General Secretariat, and the entire OAS has been listening to the oppressed. We have denounced human rights violations, extrajudicial executions, summary trials of civilians in military courts, sexual violence, race, ethnic, and gender-based persecution, abuses against indigenous people, persistent discrimination over the centuries, to cite a few examples. We have documented these abuses in detail and made them available to everyone so that we can make the appropriate decisions. We have many times given visibility to the attacks. We were able to stop them sometimes, but we ought to bear in mind that our worst threat is polarization, fragmentation, and vulnerability. The OAS must avoid internal polarization. It must avoid the pitfalls that dictatorships and authoritarianism have brought us in the past and now bring us to confront one another, all of us here, to confront one another as democratic states. We have to be more and more mindful of the principles and values that united us more than a century ago, because by drowning ourselves in short political positions, we make ourselves weak and vulnerable. Corruption and abuse feed on institutional weakness and is produced by attacks on democracy and on the basic principles of democracy, such as independence and separation of powers. This is our best opportunity to work based on moral consensus that leads us to make the Inter-American system a source of protection and development of our citizens. The fight for democracy and human rights is not an easy one, but it is the only way forward, especially in global and regional contexts in which voices that oppose the values of democracy and human rights have surged at an incredible speed. Attacks against democracy are on the rise. In the Western Hemisphere, those who attack democracy and human dignity have found fertile ground to operate in Cuba and Venezuela particularly. Yet, the way dictators operate in the 21st century is different from the past. Their operations are far more complex and more sophisticated than in the past, as they involve the participation of other illegal, criminal, non-state actors such as drug cartels, terrorist groups, and transnational organized crimes organizations. The threat to constitutional democracy in the Americas today, therefore, comes not only from the remaining dictatorships in the hemisphere, but from their fatal collusion with terrorist and criminal organizations. In the 20th century, we saw plain political dictatorships, while in the 21st century, we see narco and terrorist dictatorships, where the dictator is but only one of the pieces of the problem. The Sorpo dictatorship in Venezuela is a prime example of all possible human indecency in one place. I think it has been said many times and it is now well understood, I hope, the seriousness of the humanitarian crisis and of the suffering of the Venezuelan people. We have produced 4 detailed reports detailing the way the dictatorship has destroyed every element of democracy according to the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The OAS has documented the violation of human rights, of the freedom of speech, of the freedom to protest. An interdisciplinary panel of experts of the OAS documented and published the evidence of the crimes against humanity by the Maduro regime, crimes committed since at least February 2014. Since then, the case has been referred to the ICC by other 6 state parties to the Rome Statute. No investigation has yet been opened. The crime against humanity reported in 2018 are still being committed today. Every month, the indicators of these violations of human rights have to be updated, always rising. People are forced to leave the country, fleeing the inhumane conditions caused by the dictatorship. Despite the evidence and recognition that Maduro and his cronies are dictators, usurpers, violators of human rights, criminals, corrupt, he remains in Miraflores. We were the first to recognize the legitimacy of President Guaidó. 56 countries around the world do that as well. However, some in the international community still recognize Maduro as the president, which is contrary not only to the evidence, but to the various Inter-American resolutions approved in the last 2 years. Perhaps there are hidden interests, surely unethical, because whoever supports a dictator has some profound, skewed sense of what is right and what constitutes fundamental values of human dignity. The international community must continue to put pressure on the Venezuelan dictators in any way that it can, and it is consistent with international law. Several countries have applied sanctions that specifically target the dictators and its millions and billions stockpiled abroad. We need more sanctions, not less. There seems to be confusion, not just plain ideological bias, when we talk about the need for more sanctions for the Venezuelan dictators. Children are malnourished and were already starving way before the sanctions were applied to the Venezuelan dictators. Food scarcity and food apartheid is a direct result of deliberate actions by the Maduro regime against its own people, long before we published the Crimes Against Humanity report mentioned before. There was like a right of the dictators to have a golden exile in the past. Now it seems there is another right for dictators not to be investigated or to live in peace or to act as they wish. That it cannot be accepted, my dear friends. If we want to help Venezuelans and the cause of defending constitutional democracy in the region, we can't ignore the Cuban dictatorship. Cubans have been intervening in Venezuela for years. That is the intervention that has been going on, managing intelligence activity, conducting training in torture, and managing the civil registration system. The Cuban way of doing things, which is governing through fear, has been the system installed in Venezuela. At the OAS, we are intentionally bringing that disease, that is the Cuban dictatorship, to the forefront of the Inter-American affairs agenda. We want to bring visibility to the abuses of the Cuban regime for the over 6 decades. Give voice to the victims of gross human rights violations and to the victims of crimes against humanity. For far too long, the Cuban dictatorship has enjoyed international impunity. The OAS is working to end this shameless impunity. Cuba is not special, and it should not be an exception to Inter-American values and principles that are applied to all member states. All values and principles are applied to all member states, no exceptions. Those who favor decency in Inter-American affairs must really understand that the ethically poor people have a clear plan to stabilize democracy and destroy human rights, to eliminate all kinds of guarantees all around the continent. Thus, we cannot allow Venezuela to become Cuba. We cannot allow Nicaragua to become Venezuela. We can't allow others to become Nicaragua. I believe basic decency is not lost yet, at least not entirely. Going forward, we hope that the story of the Americas will be determined by the actions of principled individuals, not by the ethically poor. The OAS is already our moral rudder. We can rely on it. You can rely on it to have the appropriate responses to justice, to recognize and fight for human dignity, to counter the abuses of power. We have to live up to the commitment of exercising hemispheric multilateralism with new tools, close to the people, close to the suffering of the victims of human rights violations, close to the suffering of those who don't live under democracy and democratic rule of law.
So as a conversation starter, I would like to ask the Secretary General to maybe contextualize for us the Inter-American Democratic Charter, Article 20, and what led to triggering Article 20 for the first time in the history of the Charter. So maybe you want to explain to us what the Charter is, what Article 20 is, and what was happening there.
Yes, Article 20 is a very innovative article of the Inter-American system. And in that sense, the Charter is very innovative too. Before, the defense of democracy would happen only when the state concerned would ask for some people, some countries to come and help. Article 20 gives the possibility to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, as well as to any other member state, to defend democracy wherever they think there has been an alteration of the constitutional order. And that's why, analyzing the Venezuelan case, what was going on, the situation of practically every single essential element of democracy according to Article 3, or how of the components for the exercise of democracy according to Article 4. All these articles, Article 5, 6, we can say that practically every single article from Article 1 to Article 16 was violated by the Venezuelan regime. So we decided that after presenting 2 reports of what the situation was in Venezuela, we needed to implement the Inter-American Democratic Charter. That means a progressive collective evaluation of what was happening in Venezuela. The evolution of that is well known. There was a resolution declaring the alteration of the constitutional order, April 3rd, 2017. Then we had a new resolution declaring legitimate the elections of 18th of May, 2018. We declare then a new resolution declaring the legitimacy of the Maduro's government, and then a new resolution accepting the representative of Guaidó to the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States. That was the process. It was a long process, but it worked. It was a process of political accumulation. Not everybody was convinced at the very beginning. Everybody thought for a while that the things would become normal after a while, that what used to be, I mean, what is the first option always for the international community? To do nothing. Yeah. And you just let it go and try the things to be fixed alone by itself. And of course, that permissiveness of countries was what brought the situation to this point, to the biggest humanitarian crisis that we have ever had in the hemisphere, to systematic human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and the biggest migration crisis that we have ever seen in the hemisphere. So we have to see and learn from this case, because you let a country go down the precipice, jump into empty space, and go a failed state in free fall, like the Venezuelan case was. I mean, the rest of us, the rest of the countries of the continent and other continents will have to pay the bill, because what is going on is what the Venezuelan dictatorship is supporting its crisis. And who are paying the bill? Practically all countries in the continent, paying the bill of accepting Venezuelan migration, paying the bill of the humanitarian crisis, paying the bill of the diseases that were exported by the Venezuelan, are exported by the Venezuelan regime. So we have to think in the future that we need to address bad practices from the very beginning in order not to let them evolve into what the Venezuelan crisis is now.
Yes, the challenge that the organization faces on the strengthening of democracy is nothing short of extraordinary. One of the handouts that was circulated is the democracy perception index that surveys experts and election workers around the world. And then you have the ranking by regions of the world, of countries, as to the integrity of their electoral systems. And And the challenge, as I say, are remarkable because even here in the United States, when you look at the effort at the state level to prevent people from voting as opposed to facilitating the participation in elections, when you take into consideration that the head of state in the United States is elected indirectly, so of the last 3 presidents of the United States, 2 did not receive the majority of the votes in elections. Right? And this is the United States. So as you go across the region, the challenges are not easier than this. Professor Uraza's work has pointed to how, as part of this complex mechanism that autocrats deploy nowadays, part of that includes now taking advantage of the legitimacy of the courts to try to do through the courts, and sometimes through the constitutional courts, some of the regime changes that the autocrats seek to implement, therefore, in a way, legitimizing through the courts those changes. And the preparatory step is to pack the courts, is to change the purview of the courts. So there are challenges at the electoral level, public participation, counting votes, reporting the counting, making the elected occupy the office. But there are also these deeper institutional challenges that have to do with the institutional design and how some of the institutions have now been themselves turned against democratic practices, democratic mores. So do you sense that in the organization there is a unified, strong voice to face those challenges?
At the electoral level, we have 14 standards that are those we apply through our missions of electoral observation. We have observed for the first time the Brazilian election, for the first time the USA election. Of course, it is to apply these 14 standards, of course, is a serious challenge, and we make recommendations also that we need to make the follow-up. And sometimes what we have observed, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, the same observation will be repeated for the next elections, or so that is a permanent struggle to implement recommendations and to implement better standards. In any case, we have this index of electoral integrity, and that is a very relevant issue for us. In this country, it's particular about that because it's a very difficult election to observe because every state has a different voting system. So you really have a very serious challenge about what to observe where and how to bring all these pieces together. No, but we imagine the situation of the continent. What we deal mainly at the organization, we mainly deal with crisis. We have the Venezuelan crisis, the Nicaraguan crisis. That is mainly what we are trying to attend. Why? Because, of course, human rights violations, institutions completely deteriorated or eliminated, impossibility to achieve any guarantees or any due process in any context. So the second thing we deal with are structural problems. No, I mean we have a continent that is extremely violent. We have something like 15 of the most violent cities in the world without having an armed conflict. We have a political system that can be permeated by organized crime or drug traffickers. We have we are the most unequal continent in the world. That is the most serious challenge for democracy that we have. And when you see it, all these problems are structural. We see, for example, the last 200 years. And I always mention the case of Uruguay, because it's in 2015 that Artigas made a reform, a land reform, that trying that those that they were more vulnerable to be more benefited with the reform. And first category was widowers with children. Second, Afro-descendants and native populations. When we see Uruguay 200 years later, it is the same pattern of poverty that we had, with single mothers with children and Afro-descendants that count for 8% of the population, count for 40% of poverty. And we don't have any more indigenous people under the line of poverty because we made a genocide that eliminated them immediately after the independence. So that was the case. And so if not, we would have that structural problem so far. So imagine the situation that is practically the situation of the whole continent. The same structural problems that we had 200 years ago, we still have them now. So that is the second pattern. We deal with crisis and then with these structural problems. And then, if we have time enough, we try to eradicate some bad practices that start operating wherever in the continent. And we try to keep the countries out of crisis. When we started talking about the Venezuelan case, it was not, we were trying to rescue the country from that crisis. We were saying, look, this country is going down the drain. This country is going to jump into the precipice. All what is going on is completely nuts, and it is not a possible response of these people because, first of all, they are crooks in the government. I mean, that is the first issue. The connection of those who are ruling Venezuela now with the organized crime and drug trafficking is a trademark or an imperative need in order to be part of that government. But second, is the most inefficient government that have ever existed, dictatorship or not, and that is the biggest issue. For example, you want to fix something about education or the productive system in Venezuela. You think Maduro can do it? He can't do it. He has always been the most, to have worse rates, worse figures than Venezuela, you need to be a failed state in this world. No other state in this world has worse figures than Venezuela. So that is the case that we had. And we say we need to address this issue. We need to really implement and intervene with the tools that we have in order to promote democracy, because the electoral integrity is one thing, and how democracy works is another thing. The thing is that democracy is the most relevant tool that we have for development and security in the continent. Something that we did was something like this. When we did was like this. Here are those that they somehow, the cases where democracy is working better. Here that they are sort of working. Here not so well, and here are the extreme cases. Mm-hmm. Here was Venezuela in free fall, and here is a structural problem. Here the thing is that where democracy works better, you have better development, you have better security, and you have better access to rights and equality. And where democracy works, it doesn't work, institutions don't respond, and lack of efficiency, impossibility to access to rights, is where, you have all these other structural problems coming together with that. So to have strong institutions, to have a strong democracy, is the best tool that you have in order to implement solutions for your country. In this continent, I say.
So just to open now, Professor Kenstrom.
Thank you so much for coming. I very much appreciate your coming, and I appreciate your remarks. I want to follow up on this idea that, you know, the erosion of democracy imperils human rights. And I'm also noticing how the erosion of human rights imperils democracy. So I wanted to turn your attention north and ask you about some practices that have been taking place in Central America and at the southern border of the United States, where we've seen some real attacks on the fundamental rights of migrants and asylum seekers. In particular, I'm thinking about family separation policies at the southern border, the outsourcing of migration enforcement in Mexico, and attempts by the Trump administration to forge agreements with Guatemala, with El Salvador, with Honduras, calling them safe third countries so that people would not be able to apply for asylum from those places. I wonder what you think about these practices, and if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between that and protecting democracy as well.
Yes. You know, erosion of democracy has many levels. First one, I would say, is when you start not applying the Constitution or trying to do things to introduce some practices that they may not look unconstitutional from that side, but they are definitely unconstitutional in their purpose. And we have seen that too often and too many times related to separation of power, independence of different branches of government, and protection of fundamental rights and guarantees. We have always we need to address fundamental rights in their own category, and we have introduced in our Organization of American States resolutions related to the protection of migrants, and related to the cases that you have mentioned, addressing them particularly. We have asked for visits in situ to the southern border of the United States, northern border of Mexico, and of course the northern triangle of Central America. And of course, every time a fundamental right, being of a migrant or any person, is affected, definitely there is a starting point for the erosion of democracy. It's not at the level of maybe of the institutional issues. What we need to do is always to reinforce the institutions in order to provide answers to this. And we need to permanently keep working with the countries in order to reinforce the rights of the migrants whose rights are definitely affected by this situation. We have seen this for so many years. I mean, this is not a new case. It's definitely not a new case. We have seen this in the recent past and in the immediate past and the remote past. When I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, we started having the case of Uruguayans deported. That was a new case for us, because Uruguayans we can camouflage anywhere. No, we are not so evidently migrants, but somehow they were identified and they were deported. Sometimes the procedures were a little bit beyond of what the Constitution establishes. So it is not a new case, and I had to do the same in my country, my own country. Not only because of migrants or those seekers of asylum, I had to do it with the Uruguayans that were coming back. Let's say after 2008, 2009, with the European crisis, Uruguayans started coming back to Uruguay. And you know that they were very badly treated by those that they were in the country or they were public servants. So it is permanent education, and it's a permanent need in order to reinforce democracy, to reinforce rights, the rights of everybody. When we say more rights for more people, we are talking about the most sensitive cases of those that who are permanently affected, and those that they are more vulnerable. And migrants, they are definitely a very vulnerable population. So any time we do, but we address that a little more concern about the human rights of the person than the functioning of democracy. You know, sometimes democracy can still be developing without some of these structural critical problems that we mentioned, but it is to protect the rights of the people, because the people is definitely much more important than anything else, and anything that we do, it has to be related to the protection of the people.
Professor Clough.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary General, thank you again for coming. I think it's fair to say the Organization of American States institutionally is kind of in the middle between the European Union and the African Union in terms of regional institutional structure. And I was wondering from your perspective, looking to the future, would you like to see the Organization of American States have greater integration? And if so, in what way? And if not, why not?
Yeah, that we should rewind and go to the past, because when more integration was proposed, it was rejected by Latin American countries themselves. That was a project of ALCA. So, and that rejection, of course, of a completely integrated trade area in the whole Americas was always very suspicious for some of the Latin American ideologies of some of the Latin American countries. So we are not completely ready to have the whole hemisphere integrated, no matter how much I would like that. I think we somehow missed an opportunity. Maybe but like every agreement that you have, and the European Union is not far from that. It is how you negotiate it. You may negotiate it well and it may work well, and you may negotiate it bad and it may work bad. Even it can be a bad agreement that you make it work well. It has happened. It's a good agreement that you make it work bad. It happens too. And it happens permanently to the European Union. That's why all the challenges that they are facing these days about democracy and about their own structure. So my feeling today is that I would like the whole continent to be democratic, and I would like the whole continent to be free of dictatorships. That is my main aim today. And to eradicate the bad practices and try to resolve these structural problems. I think, in fact, too ambitious, because if these problems have lasted 200 years, I guess they will survive my 5-year term.
Ma'am, behind Professor Clough, yes.
Yes, I actually had a question. So regarding the recent photos of Guaido with the FARC, do you think that undermines his integrity as like a candidate, especially because you said that dictators weren't like the only mechanism of governmental corruption, but rather it's like a conglomerate of people? Could that be a bad sign?
Yes. You know, I'm always expecting some narco to have a photo with me, because I take photos with everybody, so I don't have a clue with who I'm taking photos. So a photo doesn't mean anything really, and we cannot judge a person because of that. I mean, I wonder why not one narco have taken a photo with me, because and why they didn't send a narco to take a photo with me, because it is the easiest thing in the world. And for what I have seen from Guaidó, and I don't want to definitely judge anything, but what I have seen with Guaidó, he does the same. Everybody gets near him, a photo, and that's it. So that is the reality in many ways of politics. So if we have something to say about him that connects him in a deeper way, like with the evidence we have about the Maduro regime or my dear friend Diosdado Cabello, that really have strong connections with drug trafficking. If we have a little bit more evidence, then I will be extremely helpful. But with a photo, it's very, very little what I can do and what I conclude from that. Thank you.
Sir.
Yes. My name is Ricardo Sanabria. I'm from Venezuela, and I recently arrived to Boston. I was living in Venezuela, and one of the things I used to happen to think is that democracies sometimes require like a very solid education base. And one of the things that happened after 20 years of dictatorship, or after 20 years of a government that's been insisting in make everyone poorer, the education base has actually, has decreased and has deteriorated. And I'm wondering if there's actually a possibility to have a democracy in such a problematic society. Having to say that once, if you don't have education, if you don't have dignity, you're gonna vote like a gorilla would vote for whatever, And it's very tragic to say it, but that's pretty much what happens currently in the countries like mine, which I love, and I have an education program called Venezuela 6VGS, which is based in an aerial photography of the country. But I insist that education, there has to be like a transition where it's almost a dictatorship, but a good dictatorship, so that that education actually starts to build up again. And once we're prepared for that, then I don't know. It's my ignorant side of point of view.
There's a view that has 200 years.
Yeah, more. It's first of all, I would like to remember a phrase of another Uruguayan, José Valle Ordóñez, that it is not that the people are never wrong, but the thing is that the people are the only one that it can be wrong, that it has the right to be wrong. So you have to allow the people to decide in every single case, no matter why, and no matter what. And of course, the most educated society can vote wrong, according to my perspective. Nevertheless, we need to accept it, and that is how it works. And I highly appreciate when, there is something that my feeling always about democracy, my biggest issue is that I can't do more. I would like to do more. I would like to resolve the educational level of everybody, the income level of everybody, the patterns of social standards of everybody. And I feel that first one, I have to guarantee them the right to decide. And if you don't guarantee them the right to decide, you are taking from them the most basic good that they have, that is freedom. When you don't let them decide, you're taking freedom from them. And that is something look, the fellows that made my country, that fought in every single battle and that they somehow orientated the future of the country, were not so well-educated people, not even for those years. And they made something, they made it work. And the masses here, Uruguay, and the rest of the continent, they made it work. I think we were not grateful enough to them. We were not just and fair enough to them. And we need to be fair now, and we need to be just now. And we need to, when I like politics, when I discuss in the Congress, the Senate, or when I discuss in the Permanent Council some issues, no. I like politics when I can have contact with people, and the people can tell me whatever they want about whatever issue. And that is my concern. Was my concern when I was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I told Mujica, look, if one day I used to walk from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the presidency and back. Colonia, by those days we have already legalized marijuana, so on the walk I would smoke 3 or 4 pots. And the way back, 18 de Julio was a little, the air was not so heavy. But I told him, look, if one day I cannot walk this way and back, I will resign, because if the people don't accept me anymore for what I am doing or what I am delivering, then I just stop, because it doesn't serve any purpose. It is too much of a high price to be a politician. So I feel that the connection with people, we always have to have it. And then, we never have to resign, and we never have to see our own people from above. We have to see it from, I am not more than any other Uruguayan, I am not less than any other Uruguayan, I am not more than any other Latin American, I am not less than any other Latin American, and I feel not more than any other American, not less than any other American. And I will defend the right of the people to decide above whatever else in the world.
Ma'am?
Yeah, this is a completely different area, but I'm a Venezuelan too, and obviously lived with my whole family the tragedy that's happening in our country. And I was wondering what tools do we have in the Americas or the OAS as a respected and knowledgeable to confront the foreign powers that are giving oxygen to the regime, like China, Russia, in Venezuela? And how do you confront them directly, embarrass them, make them responsible, or see some of it, that it's their responsibility for giving this, for economic gain?
I want to answer the second part of his question before.
Right.
And it is true that we need to have better citizens as much as we can. And education is something that we need to deliver. Civic education is something that we need to deliver. I think democracy is better to deliver that kind of civic education than a dictatorship, ever. But today, citizens have better possibilities, better tools in order to participate politically. So, and they have more freedom in order to participate, so they have to be more responsible. And to be more responsible, they have to have better knowledge of what is going on. But I think that the best political discussion is when you have a democracy and when you have the possibility to integrate yourself into the decisional process. You know, that is not what Russia and China are nations with thousands of years of civilization behind. and they have always negotiated their path about every single issue in the world, and they have participated in international affairs for longer than any other country in this hemisphere. My biggest concern about Venezuela is the constituency of Maduro. That is ELN, FARC dissidents, drug cartels, the colectivos, and the Cubans. When you see these 5 political actors of the constituency of, let's say, of the Maduro regime, not to blame Maduro entirely, because I think if you change Maduro, you don't change anything. If you don't change these actors of the political system, but analyze them, ELN, they have never wanted a peace agreement of any kind. They have never wanted a negotiation of any kind with the Colombian government. Anytime that they have been somehow forced into a negotiating table, they have made a terrorist attack and they have blown up something in the most awful way. FARC dissidents, they didn't even want this peace agreement that his comrades signed with the government. They moved out from there in order to keep doing their business. Drug cartels, I have never seen peace with drug cartels. The only peace that they find is when they kill thousands of dozens of people. The Cubans, they have never showed their hands, but they know that they need the 30,000 barrels that they take from Venezuela daily, and they can't afford to live without those barrels. And they know that there is no a single friend or country in this world that they can give them those barrels. They know that their biggest friends in the 80s, 70s, 80s, suddenly stopped any help to them. So they know that if they don't take it, they will not have it. So with those, I think it is very difficult to fix a negotiation, because it's not that they need Maduro to be there. They need Maduro in order to operate in that country, to keep this status quo that they have. And so they will not be able to pull back. And it is very hard to negotiate with them, because they have never wanted a peaceful solution of any kind, not in this environment, not in any other environment. And I think that is the biggest problem that the Venezuelan regime has. If you have something to negotiate with China and Russia, they will negotiate it, and it will be fine at the end of the day. But with those that they have mentioned, it is impossible, practically impossible. Nobody has been able to do it for decades about anything, and I think that is the biggest challenge that your country is facing.
As a closing question, I want to invite your powers of imagination and travel to the end of the century and tell us what do you see for the OAS? How will the institution be looking like in 3 generations from now?
Can I use these guessing powers to guess the numbers of the lottery in the weekend?
Yes, okay. Yes, as long as you share them. As long as you share them.
You know, it's, I think we need to evolve to citizen participatory democracy. That was and I think it's the natural evolution of our democracies these days. We will need efficient institutions, but the participation of people will be higher than everything that we have seen in the past. We are evolving into that. we are providing more and better tools for citizens to participate and to integrate to the solutions or denounces. The power that the citizens have, it wasn't thinkable, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago. Today, they are the first to denounce environmental disasters, corruption, or human rights violations. And I think that will keep evolving. And the more educated the people will be, the better will participate into politics. At the same point, in order to keep the political system working, institutions will have to be more efficient. Institutions cannot wait too much now in order to resolve issues. They need to deliver very fast, because you are not just in, let's say, 5 years later during an election. You will be judged today, and people will be angry or upset with you today. So these two things will be very necessary to put it together in the future of our political systems. So we definitely need to evolve into that in order to preserve the democratic system. In fact, the citizens' democracy was the longest democracy in the world now, like the Greek democracy. Like, we need to integrate more citizens that the Greeks used to do, and work it in a different way. But we need to have that capacity in order to make democracy stand in the long term.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.